You're welcome. A special part of the program, In the Footsteps of Sergeant York, is our first traveling exhibit. And we're excited about the idea that it's downtown now at the military branch of the Tennessee State Museum. It's in the end of the War Memorial Building downtown. The display opens this morning at 10 o'clock. It runs till 5 o'clock this evening, and we'd be thrilled to have you all come down and walk through it and just see how well it turned out. But the history is what we're trying to preserve, and In the Footsteps of Sergeant York captures an amazing story about an ordinary American soldier who did some extraordinary things in France. And today we want to talk about how we preserve some artifacts from him directly, some artifacts from the patrol that he was on from France itself, but most importantly the story and the history that it all represents, and that's what the museum's all about. It's exciting to consider that the history goes on even today in Iraq and Afghanistan, that soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen are still at risk to protect the freedoms that we enjoy and cherish here today.
You get to introduce the York.
Oh, exciting, yeah. We're so pleased, especially about the York family being here. Got to have George York and Betsy York, who are actually son and daughter of Sergeant York. And to think about it, the history that it represents from Fentress County in Tennessee to France, and really to then the iconic figure of World War I, Sergeant York, and to have the family come and to be a part of it, we're just thrilled to have you. And it's gone full circle. It's gone full circle from Fentress County to France and now back here to Nashville. We're thrilled about the opportunity to celebrate and maintain the history, and to be a part of that in the Museum of the American Military Experience is just priceless to us. We're glad you're here. Thank you for coming. We're excited too to have Dr. Stan Carpenter that's going to do an introduction of the World War I history and the American experience and our part in the war, largely forgotten, but coming to an amazing centennial celebration in 2018. We're excited that the Sergeant York display will be here in Nashville for 6 months, and then we'll actually take it on the road and have it at the Pink Palace in Memphis for 6 months. We plan to rotate it through Tennessee, 2 or 3 more locations, and then the hope and the plan is ultimately that the Sergeant York display might be a part of the American presentation in France for the centennial celebration by 2018. It's neat to have something turn out so well with the first effort. Dr. Carpenter is serving as, has served and still serves with the Strategy and Policy Division as the head for the College of Distance Education, United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He administers strategy and war non-resident programs, serves as a professor of strategy and policy, holds degrees from Florida State University, University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's doing graduate studies still, Department of War Studies, King's College, University of London. In June 2009, he published Resurrection of Antimony, the first in a series of World War II action, adventure, historic novels, currently working on a study of the British Southern Campaign 1778 to 1781 in the War for American Independence, addressing British strategic problems leading to the defeat at Yorktown, Virginia in October 1781. He's helping to maintain this history too, and this book's a part of that. This is the book he shared with us, Resurrection of Antimony, perfect Christmas gift. They're available up here too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, that's your stuff.
My notes.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Here you go. We'll get it all together.
Okay, now there's no telling how this thing's going to turn out.
This is the back.
That's the back.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, a few notes before I start. First off, I'd like to thank the board of directors for inviting me here. I do a lot of these public presentations and thoroughly enjoy them. And it's a pleasure and honor to be here to talk about World War I, the American involvement, and specifically the actions of Sergeant Alvin York. A couple of things. You'll notice I am in uniform. However, I am retired. 30 years, Navy, active duty, and reserve. I retired in 2009. But the board asked me to come in uniform, and I'm always glad to put it back on. So that's a pleasure. What I'm going to do today, and I apologize for this slide here, the lighting, you never know how the lighting is going to be in any particular room, and there's a bit of a glare off the screen. So hopefully you'll be able to see these pictures that we've got here. This probably is the worst one, so just sort of a caveat there. What I want to do is address essentially 4 topics in the next, say, 25-30 minutes. I'm going to start with the evolution of the static war position, it's called, or the trench warfare. The war on the Western Front, how that evolved in the early months of World War I, which is going to really set up the pattern of war that the United States forces saw when they got engaged in earnest in 1918. Then I'm going to flip to why did the U.S. get involved? Highlight some of the features of that 1917 time frame when the United States finally decided to declare war on the Central Powers. Sorry. That's fine. Throw these away.
Thought you knew this by heart.
Well, I do, but you know, when you turn 29 like I just did last month, and I'm not looking forward to 30. The third thing I want to talk about is a little bit more focused on the Meuse-Argonne campaign of September to November 1918, which really was the high point, if you will, of U.S. involvement. And then finally, the actions of then Corporal Alvin York in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So let's launch off here. World War I, the American involvement. Well, there were several factors in 1917 that really propelled the United States into the war. The first one, that's probably better known to the public, is Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare campaign. What that essentially meant was that any ship of any nation of any type sailing into the exclusionary zones around Britain and France would be attacked by submarines. Now, submarines were a new form of warfare, and they were considered barbaric at the time because you could attack subsurface with a torpedo, or you could surface next to a vulnerable ship and open fire with a deck gun with no warning. There was another problem here, and that is what you do with anybody that evacuates off the ship. You can't take them on board the submarines. You're going to see some photographs and just realize just how small these things were. So it was considered barbaric. It was considered ungentlemanly, if you will. Remember the time frame that we're dealing with, and caused a tremendous amount of public anger in the United States. It had started in 1915 with the Lusitanian incident, where a number of Americans were killed on board a liner. Well, here is a German submarine torpedoing a civilian non-combatant liner carrying hundreds and hundreds of passengers, and over 100 American lives were lost. So that sort of set the stage, and Germany backed off. But in January 1917, as you'll see when I go into it a bit, they started up again unrestricted submarine warfare. And now, any type of ship was a target from any nation, neutral or not. So that's one thing. The Zimmermann telegram. The Germans were trying to get the Mexicans to create trouble along the southern border. And this telegram was actually sent from the German foreign minister named Zimmermann to his ambassador in Mexico City, which basically said, make a proposal to the Mexican government that will support them if they take action against the United States. Well, British intelligence, by the way, Resurrection Man Timony has a lot to do with that, not that particularly, but based on British intelligence operations. They broke the code and, oh, by the way, snuck it to the United States. You might want to see this. It broke into the newspapers, and that really was what it took. And so in April of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. And that's how the United States really got engaged. There is what Europe looked like essentially at the start of the war. And so just to orient you, because I really am into the spatial orientation thing, the Axis powers, or rather the Central powers at the time, would have been Germany, Austria-Hungary. Later on, Bulgaria joined, and the Ottoman Empire. For the Serbia, and later Italy joined. So, and Russia was also part of that. So you see, essentially, the Central powers are on a two-front war there. That is essentially what we're talking about in terms of the geography. Let's go to some war plans. And the reason why the war evolved into a static trench war of position. Well, what about the French? They had Plan 17. They expected war with Germany, and if it happened, they were going to charge into Alsace-Lorraine, which was that area between Germany and France that had been fought over fairly regularly in the previous century. But the French had this offensive attitude. It was called élan. By the way, are there any French speakers in here? Oh, okay. I thought you would be, Mr. Moore, or Dr. Moore. Okay. I read French. I translate French, right? I don't speak French. So please don't jump up, raise your hand, and say, you mispronounced that, because I'm probably going to butcher it. But everybody else is going to sound really good. Élan, which basically translates more or less to spirit. And the idea here of the French was trust in cold steel and to charge ahead. Imagine how that works in the face of artillery fire and machine guns. So if you're looking at why this thing evolved into these defensive trench works with barbed wire and no man's land and massive casualties, think about that offensive orientation. The French believed at the time that courage, boldness, aggressiveness, you charge straight at the opponent, and just your spirit, your élan, is going to overwhelm the enemy. Well, of course, they found out pretty quick that was not the case. What about the Germans? Well, you might have heard of the Schlieffen Plan. Came from the chief of the German Imperial General Staff by about 1905. And the basic theory here is in case of war with France, you're probably going to have war with Russia over here because they're allied. So you got to knock one or the other out early. Well, the Schlieffen Plan was designed to knock France out early before either the Russians or the British, their allies, could really get engaged. So the idea was to come charging in great strength across through Belgium, violating their neutrality, circle around, encircle the French forces, take Paris. Oh, by the way, what are the French doing? They're charging into Alsace-Lorraine. So you're essentially outflanking and hitting them in the rear. And of course, historically, you take Paris, France surrenders. So that was the plan. Only problem was, when they actually implemented it, the Russians fought better and mobilized quicker than anybody thought. So Germany's having to rush forces into Poland and that area, and it takes away forces from this. And also Helmuth von Moltke, famous German name, who was chief of the general staff, got cold feet. He panicked. He started ordering forces from up here down to stop this. And so the thrust here came up short, about 30 miles short of Paris at the Marne, and that was the famous Battle of the First Marne. So once this happened, what you tended to have in the rest of 1914 and into 1915 was all the way from the North Sea down to the Swiss border, digging in. Trenches, dugouts, protected, defended positions, and that's essentially how the war evolved really into a static war position. And there, I think there's another map you can see. This was the furthest extent of the Germans. Almost got to Paris. There's the Marne River. And they were pushed back, and so the trench lines basically equalized along through there and eventually ended up back there. So you see, the whole war in the Western Front was basically fought in that very narrow corridor, if you will. What about the U-boats? By a show of hands, how many of you would like to go to sea in that? Right? Well, early submarines, And these had only been in existence now for about 15 years at this time, so they were very primitive. They tended to sail like regular ships and only go subsurface when they were about to initiate a torpedo attack. They were not very capable, they were not very large. Nonetheless, they could do a tremendous amount of damage. And as I mentioned earlier, the Germans in 1915 had done quite a bit of damage to merchant ships, and then they backed off. But in early 1917, they decided they were going to try it again. And this is why. Their German Navy that they had built up prior to the war was basically sitting in port, rusting away, because the British Grand Fleet, the Royal Navy, was pretty much blockading them in. Because of that blockade, there was a tremendous amount of hunger in Germany. In fact, the winter of 1916 was known as the turnip winter, because a lot of people, that's about all they had to eat was just raw turnips. It really was more a function, not so much of the British blockade, as it was manpower. So many men were in the army that they couldn't man the farms. And so there was a tremendous food problem, and the German authorities decided they needed a victory of some kind to knock Great Britain out of the war. Well, Britain's an island, and Britain can only feed itself maybe half of the food it needed. It all had to come in by ship. So if you cut off the shipping, then Britain's going to very soon have to capitulate. So the risk here that you take is if you start the submarine campaign again, you risk getting the United States involved. But the theory is we can knock Great Britain out of the war, and if Britain goes out, France will give up before the United States gets engaged. Now that's the theory at any rate. Well, it looked pretty good at the start. Here we start actually in January. Look at these statistics for sinkings in April. But they calculated if they could sink 600,000 tons of shipping coming into Britain a month, they would win the war. Well, first 3 or 4 months, it looked pretty good, didn't it? The problem was, once the United States got involved in April, the United States, by God, Navy got there. Okay? And the Allies had developed a lot more techniques for hunting down submarines. Hydrophones, which you can drop down and listen for the screw beats of a submarine's propeller. Depth charges, which are basically big explosives in cans that you fire off the deck and they go down. They go to a pressure depth set and explode. And so it really pretty well got, by the summer, the German submarines under control. So you start seeing what happens here by the end of 1917. Well, back in here in April is where the United States declared war on Germany. So their gamble, their calculation that they could knock Britain out of the war by submarine action before the United States got involved was really pretty faulty. And that's what happens. Then there's another factor, and that is the United States Navy. That is a famous painting, The Return of the Mayflower. That is the 4th destroyer flotilla arriving in Irish waters. One of the first actions that the United States took upon declaration of war was to send the Navy, primarily destroyers, to go on anti-submarine patrol. And this was the 1st Squadron under Commander Taussig, later Vice Admiral Taussig. And when they arrived in Queenstown, Ireland, the British Admiral who commanded that sector of ocean hosted a dinner for Commander Taussig and most of the senior officers. And the British Admiral figured, well, it'll take a number of weeks or months before these Americans are ready for combat operations. So he just asked Commander Taussig, "Sir, when will you be ready for sea?" And the reply was, "We are ready now, sir. That is, as soon as we finish refueling." And that's exactly what they did. The very next day, out on anti-submarine patrol. Something that nobody expected. Now, the Army was somewhat different, because we had in 1917 the world's 17th largest army. 17th. If you're going to engage the Germans, you better start recruiting, drafting, training, building up. So while the U.S. Navy was ready for action in April 1917, it really was not till the summer of 1918 that the U.S. Army had sufficient numbers, sufficient training and equipment to be ready to engage the Germans in a sort of meaningful way. Nonetheless, here we are. That is General John J. Blackjack Pershing arriving in France, and what did he say? Lafayette, we are here. The return of the Americans to France. And what he's referring to is the American War of Independence, the American Revolution, where a significant amount of French aid aided the colonists in that effort. So Lafayette, we are here. What about General Pershing? Interesting guy. As I said, the reality was the United States Army was nowhere ready for any kind of combat operation on a large scale. You had to recruit the men, you had to train them, you had to equip them. And equipment was a huge problem. We used a lot of rifles, Enfield rifles, which were British models. In fact, Sergeant York, some of you may know that was what his unit was equipped with. We didn't have any kind of light machine gun, squad machine gun. So we used the French Shosho. By the way, you can see one of those at the museum. I saw it yesterday. It's a very rare piece. The problem with that particular gun, and when you look at it, when you actually see the display, look at the ammo clip, which is sort of a, what is that, crescent-shaped sort of thing, and look very carefully at it, and you see it's open to the air. And so what the American troops found, as the French troops had before them, you put that into the mud and the muck of the trench warfare, what tends to happen? Yeah, dirt, sand, grit, and you'll get all 3 rounds in it jams. So it pretty much was a useless weapon. This is why the United States government said we must develop very quickly a squad light machine gun, and that was the origin of the BAR, the Browning Automatic Rifle, which actually reached the troops by the Meuse-Argonne offensive. They were, many of them equipped with the Browning Automatic Rifle. Well, General Pershing resisted putting American troops piecemeal into British and French units. Now, some units did fight with our allies, but he said, let's get ready to go, and we go in as the U.S. First Army, the American Expeditionary Force. And because of this, it really was not until the summer of 1918 when General Pershing was ready to permit the U.S. First Army in any meaningful numbers. And this is going to be the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. By the way, a lot of people wonder, where did he get the name Blackjack? He had commanded at one point in the 1890s a unit of the 10th U.S. Cavalry. Does anybody know what was distinctive about them, the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry?
They're black.
They were all black units.
Buffalo soldiers.
All the Buffalo soldiers, yeah, those were the two. This was before the U.S. forces were integrated, which happened in 1947. But they had white officers, so he was one of those. And then when he went back to West Point as an instructor, the students started calling him Black Jack, and that's why he got that name. Not many people know that that's why he got it. And another interesting thing about him, he is the second highest ranking United States officer in history. Who was number 1? Washington, I heard it, George Washington, by act of Congress, I think, in 1964. So when you hear this mythical 6-star general thing, there were only 2 of them, Washington and Pershing. Interesting fellows. All right, let's get on to the Meuse-Argonne campaign. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Frenchman, he was appointed as essentially the commander-in-chief of all Allied forces in the Western Front in 1918. And he said, we need an offensive to cut the German lines to the city of Metz, which was one of those key junctions where the Germans were moving a lot of their supplies, logistics, and reinforcements through. And as a precursor to that, he ordered General Pershing and the uniformed U.S. First Army to conduct a preliminary attack on the St. Mael salient. And when we go to another map, you'll see where that appears. But essentially, it was a U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped area that the Germans had not been pushed out of, and the offensive was to basically push them back and to stabilize the line. Well, the Germans cooperated here because they realized they couldn't hold it, and they began withdrawing back to the Hindenburg line, which was a defensive position in the rear. But the advantage of the St. Mael offensive was it gave U.S. troops some good experience, some good combat action prior to the Meuse-Argonne campaign. So the attack went fairly quickly. This is 4 to it's 12 to 16 September, and the offensive was successful. You can see how the line eventually straightened out, and U.S. troops were bloodied, if you will, with some experience. Then we have this gentleman, George C. Marshall. He was a colonel at the time. He was one of the staff officers to General Pershing. There he is at West Point in his cadet uniform. There he is as a 5-star general at the end of World War II. So once the San Miguel offensive was over, then you needed to get all these American troops moved with all their equipment, artillery, everything, to the northeast to get ready for the Meuse-Argonne campaign. This man organized it. It was one of the most amazing feats in military history, to move an entire army in just a few days with all their equipment and guns and everything, several miles, and reposition them for the offensive. By the night of the 25th of September, so what are we looking at here? 9 days to move that entire army. 820,000 U.S. and French troops with all their supporting artillery, engineers, logistics, everything were ready to kick off the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And so I wanted to highlight the role that then Colonel George C. Marshall played. And you look at incidents like that, and then you begin to understand, if you know anything about World War II history, why he was such a phenomenal chief of staff of the Army, and so highly successful. Okay, so there we have the front. And it was known as the 100 Days Offensive. Yep, see, I knew we got out of order. Give me just a second here to...
Sorry, Stan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want me to help you some more?
No.
The Army always wants to help the Navy.
I thought this was a subtle plot. You guys. Well, the 100 Days Offensive was essentially that last offensive of the war. It went from September to November 1918, and the idea was to put pressure on Germany and drive them back and force them to basically negotiate an armistice. And that, in fact, is what happened. I think I'm getting here. I could do this without notes, but I just want to make sure I don't miss anything that's critical. So give me just a moment here. Okay, let's press ahead. The idea here was the British forces were going to attack in force headed towards Ghent in Belgium. The French forces would attack through this area in the center, and down here in the south, that would be a combined French and American attack. And you'll see the line here, they were headed towards the city of Sedan, right here on the Meuse River. So this is the Meuse Valley. Here's the Argonne Forest. Here is that San Miguel sailing. So you wanted to straighten the line, because if you had German troops here and you're going to move up here, you're outflanked automatically. You don't want to have that happen. So that's why that first offensive there. And there's an even closer shot you see. There is San Miguel. Here is the Meuse-Argonne. And there is the goal, Sedan. If you can push in through there, look what happens. You've outflanked all the Germans in this area. So that really was the idea behind the offensive. And there is an even better shot. The offensive kicked off the 26th of November, and there was an incident here. How many of you saw about 6-8 years ago, I think it was on the History Channel, The Lost Battalion? Quite a number of you saw. I think Ricky Schroeder played Major. Well, there's where that happened. And essentially the offensive went so well that they pushed ahead about 5 miles ahead of the line, and of course got cut off and surrounded, and for several days were under heavy attack. What eventually happened here is the 82nd Infantry Division, and by the way, that is the famous 82nd Division that in World War II became the Airborne Division. Let me just reorganize here just a second. Again, I don't want to miss anything critical that I have here. Okay. All right. see you later here.
I'm hiding now.
Where are you there? There's a reason why you brought that cane, isn't it?
Amen.
Okay. The area was commanded by this gentleman, General Georg von der Marwitz, and that's him right there. This, by the way, who is that? Anybody know who that is? A staff. Who? Nope, that's Hindenburg there. Who is this?
That must be the Kaiser.
That's the Kaiser.
Yeah.
Kaiser of Germany. Germany had built extensive defensive works in front of the Meuse River, and eventually 200,000 German troops in 44 divisions were moved in there to man that defensive area. It was high ground, it was hilly ground. You're going to see some photographs of it, and our two speakers coming up will talk about some of the spatial, the geography of the area. But it was very good defensive ground, because one of the maxims of warfare is you always want to take the high ground. And it gave excellent observation, and the east-west ridges running along the Argonne Forest provided excellent defensive positions. There is Major Whittlesey. I mentioned him earlier, won the Medal of Honor. He was a lawyer before the war, lawyer from New York. One of those interesting characters that goes to war and really thrives as a war commander. Well, here's a little bit of the geography. Now, this was actually taken probably the winter of 1918, but the main target of Sergeant York's unit, which was the 328th Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Division, was Hill 223, also known as Castle Hill. And you can see how that would command this whole valley in here. If you had positions on there and you're looking down, that's huge advantage. So the 328th Infantry Division was assigned the task of taking this hill, which was also known as Castle Hill. I don't know that there was a castle on there, but that's what the Americans called it, as well as Hill 223. By the way, anybody know why you name it something like Hill 223? What does that mean? Any Army types here that would know that?
It's what the hill's number on the map.
Well, they put it a number on the map, but it's basically
Yeah, the elevation.
the elevation. There you
Yeah.
go. So it would have been 223 meters in elevation. That's pretty tall. So you can see why that would be a target here. And this assault on Hill 223 is going to be the focus of Sergeant York. This was in the second phase of the campaign. Also in the second phase of the campaign, the French were fairly successful in their sector. They pushed 20 miles in all the way to the Aisne River, where the Germans tried to establish, if you will, a last-ditch defense. And I put this up here because that gives you an idea of some of the trench works there that they're along the river they're trying to defend against the French. Tremendous casualties from the start of this whole Meuse-Argonne campaign. Because now the Americans, despite thinking we have advantages because we're better shots or we're not going to be sucked into this massive frontal assaults against defended fortifications, whatever, those illusions very quickly disappeared. Because when you're going up against this robust defensive line of trenches, of machine guns and what have you, the hard reality is there only is one way in, and that's straight ahead. Tremendous casualties in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. If you look at the number of casualties that United States forces suffered in this, although the American Civil War had huge casualties, in any one battle, more Americans were killed in the Meuse-Argonne offensive than in any other American battle, including all those of the Civil War. So you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands upon Americans. And I just put that up just so we understand what was going on here and what war can really be like. And that's an American cemetery there at Montfaucon, which was one of the targets of the offensive. Well, American field artillery opened fire, and because of this, the Germans decided to essentially pull back a little bit to get away from the artillery fire. And because of this, the 328th was able to move in and take Hill 323. But the Germans decided to counterattack. And that, in fact, is what is going to set up Sergeant York and his actions on the 8th of October. The fact that the Germans have decided to move back in to try to retake the hill and hold it. Now, this is an area near a place called Châtel-Cherrier, and I hope I got that more or less right, Dr. Moore. That is the scene of the York action. What's interesting about this, if you didn't know that that was in the middle part of France, where might you say that looks like? Exactly. And so if you're looking at Sergeant York, who was very used to operating in this type of terrain as a hunter, you can only imagine how he looked at this and was probably thinking to himself, I can use cover, concealment, I can use my skills as a hunter in the hills and mountains of Tennessee because this is just what I'm used to. And that's something that you guys always remember when you go into war is the terrain factor of it. I'm not sure how close this is to the actual site, but this is a good picture of what the terrain looked like near that little village where this action took place. The objective on this particular day of the 328th Infantry Regiment was a rail line. The idea was to cut the rail line that the Germans were using to send in reinforcements and ammunition and food. If you cut the rail line, they'd be forced to retreat. But the Germans, realizing how vital this rail line was, had posted 50 machine gun nests on the crest of this particular hill. And that's what's going to cause huge casualties among the 328th. The attack commenced on the 8th of October, about 6 in the morning. There was no artillery barrage. One of the things in World War I that characterized it was you always had a massive artillery barrage before you started the infantry attack. For some reason, the order, the fog of war, did not get to the artillery in time, and so the infantrymen moved out against these machine gun nests without any pre-action artillery bombardment. And there is a painting of the troops advancing into action. One of the things you notice, and you're going to see a photograph here to back this up, this is the forest, right? What do you not see?
Trees.
You don't see many leaves, right? When you see a photograph of what these battlefields look like because of the artillery and the machine gun, all the ammunition expended, it basically denuded the trees. It looked like a forest fire had come through. Just stumps and, well, we'll see it eventually, but just basically stumps and left of the trees without any sort of leaves. So, yes, in fact, it was a forest, but not much of one by this time. Okay, let's turn now to the last part of my talk, and that is specifically focusing in on then Corporal, later Sergeant Alvin York. And I mentioned earlier he was assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Infantry Division. He was opposed to killing on religious grounds, and in fact, when he registered for the draft, he registered as a conscientious objector, but when it came time to make a decision, he decided that that despite his qualms about killing and violence and pacifism, he decided that God meant him to go and do this, and that it was the right thing. And so he refused to not go into the war because of his religious concern. But he decided, as I said, that God meant for him to do this, and that God would protect him. Now this is very interesting. Can anybody tell me who that is? Gary Cooper, exactly. I'm going to finish up today with a few comments about the famous movie that came out in 1941, Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper. But what I'm going to do for the next few slides, because they're really good, is intersperse some actual photographs from the period with some photographs from the movie, which is kind of interesting. Here's what happened. The regiment was taking tremendous casualties. They were pinned down by all these 50 machine gun nests. So they set 17 men, which included Corporal York. They were ordered to infiltrate behind the German lines and take out the machine gun nests so that the battalion could actually move forward. They moved forward, they got around the Germans, and they overran the command post and gathered about 70 prisoners. And when the Germans who were further up the hill saw this, they shouted down in German, essentially to the German prisoners were going to open fire, duck, whatever words they used. Well, of course, the Americans, not understanding German, didn't get this, so now all these German prisoners hit the dirt and the machine guns open up. And because of that, it killed immediately 6 of these 17 men and wounded 3 others. What this meant was now Corporal York was the commander of this unit, the survivors of this 17-man patrol. He was the only non-com left standing, non-commissioned officer. So what he did was he ordered the remaining men to get down and guard the prisoners that they had, and he worked his way up the slope of the hill, again using his hunting skills, his woodsman skills that he had learned as a young man in hills of Tennessee. And what happened was, as these German gunners had poked their heads up to look down the hill to see what was happening, he opened fire, and he was an expert marksman. And one by one, he wiped out 3 complete machine gun crews, and in fact shot and killed over 20 Germans. But he did not want to kill anybody. He basically was all this time shouting to them, surrender, surrender, surrender. Well, most of the Germans, of course, didn't understand what was being said, and even though they might have had a tendency to, they didn't know what was going on, and they kept popping up trying to get a bead on the Americans, and next thing you know, they get a 30-06 round through their helmet. There was a group of Germans, about 6 of them, led by an officer who attempted to charge York, who was now out of ammunition in his Enfield rifle. So he pulled out a .45 caliber Colt weapon, which was standard issue to non-commissioned officers and to officers, and he picked them off one by one, all 6 of them, from back to front. How many rounds do you think were in his weapon? He didn't miss. Got all 6 of them. Basically 1 clip of ammunition. There is a picture of a typical machine gun crew. And when you go see the exhibit at the museum downtown, you will actually see one of these German machine guns. It's very impressive. But typically a 4 to 6 man crew. Well, the commander of the German troops was a fellow by the name of Vollmer. He was an interesting character. He was an Oberleutnant, commanded this battalion of Germans that were defending the hill. He spoke English because he had lived in Cleveland prior to the war. And he was the deputy postmaster of the city of Ulm, Germany. He was a reserve officer, had gone in, highly decorated. He had 2 or 3 Iron Crosses and a Knight's Cross. And if you know anything about German decorations, he was extremely highly decorated, if you will. What he did was, when he realized what was going on, as German troops were surrendering, he began firing his pistol at York and missed every one. Here's York not wasting around. Here's the poor German guy who can't hit anything. And one of the problems for the Germans was there was a unit of about 70 men who, just at the moment that York began his attack, had essentially put down their weapons and they were going to eat breakfast because they had had a forced march from the rear and they were tired and hungry. So they put down their weapons and started eating breakfast. So when he attacked, they were nowhere near ready to do anything. And they basically became, if you will, prisoners real quick. Let's see. We reorganize here again. I don't want to lose some of this stuff because it's pretty valuable. But, okay. March of the Defeated. I think this photograph is probably from the end of the war, but you get the idea. What happened was, once he'd emptied his pistol, Oberleutnant Vollmer realized the situation, but he also thought that he was being attacked by a massive number of Americans. You can only imagine what was going through his mind. This is not one man here. This has got to be many. But what he did was he went over to York and he said, "Good Lord, if you won't shoot anymore, I will make them give up." York agreed, because as I said earlier, he was not really interested in killing. He wanted to get him out of action. So Oberleutnant Vollmer blew his whistle, which was a typical command instrument at the time, and ordered his men to drop their weapons and come out and surrender. So Sergeant York, or then Corporal York, ordered him to line up the men, and they marched down the hill with Vollmer in the lead and Corporal York right behind him with his .45, which, by the way, was empty. But they didn't know that. U.S. troops in the Argonne, and here's what I meant by, you see the trees there? That would have been a full forest prior to this action. There's the German Hindenburg line. This is where they had retreated back to. And I just wanted to show you some photographs here of what that looked like. Here's another scene for the movie, and this is the point where that's Oberleutnant Vollmer. There's, of course, Gary Cooper playing Sergeant York. There he is again. He's now promoted to sergeant and wearing the Medal of Honor that he was awarded a couple of months later. And that's the French Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War. Here is the German after-action report. This is very interesting. An after-action report, in military terms, you simply report what happened back to headquarters. This is what they said. Quote, the flank of the 6th Company reported an enemy surprise attack. Next, the remnant of 4th Company and personnel from the 210th Regiment were caught by the surprise attack where Lieutenant Endres was killed. Well, this surprise attack was one man. The company was shattered or was captured. Also, First Lieutenant Vollmer ended up in the enemy's hands. Now the situation is worse. And again, one man caused all this carnage to the German troops. Unfortunately, the 328th did not follow up the attack. They were so decimated earlier that it allowed the Germans to pull back to the Hindenburg line, what was remaining of it. But if you look in terms of was the mission accomplished, it really was. Because if the Germans pull back, it means they're giving up ground, and it allows the Americans to move forward. So even though the follow-up attack wasn't as aggressive as it might have been, in fact, it was mission accomplished. York was promoted to sergeant, Medal of Honor, as I mentioned, the Distinguished Service Cross, French Croix de Guerre, and the Legion of Honor. And here is the citation, so I think this captures it very nicely. This was the Medal of Honor citation. Read, quote, after his platoon suffered heavy casualties and 3 other non-commissioned officers had become casualties, Corporal York assumed command. Fearlessly leading 7 men, he charged with great daring a machine gun nest, which was pouring deadly and incessant fire upon his platoon. In this heroic effort, the machine gun nest was taken together with 4 officers and 128 men and several guns. 32 German machine guns were actually captured out of the 50 that were originally posted there. York returned to the United States. Here he is at his wedding a few weeks later. He refused in the future to take any money for paid appearances. He was approached several times by Hollywood filmmakers, and he finally did in 1940 agree to taking a commission, and I'll explain what happened here in a moment, taking commission to allow a filmmaker to make it, and that became Sergeant York. He tried to re-enlist in World War II, but by this time he was in his 50s and was diabetic and overweight, and so the Army said, well, thanks, but no thanks. However, he was commissioned as an officer, a colonel with the 7th Infantry of the Tennessee State Guard, and was made an honorary colonel in the Army Signal Corps. Why is this? Because he was extremely valuable for bond tours. And I'm sure the York family can probably remember that, traveling. You might have traveled around the country or heard about it on war bond tours. So that was his contribution to World War II, particularly raising funds for the American Red Cross. What about this movie? There it is, and there's a poster for it. As I mentioned earlier, Gary Cooper starred in it in 1941. The reason why Sergeant York, even though he was technically a colonel by this time, he agreed to give the money, or agreed to allow the film to be made based on his war diary, which he kept every day. because he was funding an interdenominational Bible school, and that was where all the funds went. The movie itself received 11 Oscar nominations for 1941, and 2 of them actually were one including Best Actor for Gary Cooper. It was the highest grossing film of 1941. And it's largely because of that movie that the public is aware of Sergeant York and his actions of 8 October 1918 in the Meuse-Argonne. So what I've tried to do here is build a little picture of why the United States got involved, how the United States got involved, and ultimately what were the actions of Sergeant Alvin York on that day, 8 October 1918. So thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Birdwell, who received his PhD from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in 1996. He's archivist curator of Sergeant Alvin York's papers and assistant professor of history at Tennessee.
Full professor.
Full professor. Well, you're stuck with it now. Yeah. He is cultural historian and author of The Celluloid Soldiers, Warner Brothers' Campaign Against Nazism, and examination of Henry Warner's efforts to alert the American public about the dangers of Hitler's Germany from 1934 to 1941. Birdwell has appeared as a talking head, you do well, on A&E's biography program, History Channel's Histories, Mysteries, and is currently working on new programs for both networks, as well as a project for PBS about class in America. He's the author of a number of articles that's been published in the Tennessee Encyclopedia of History and Culture, Peter C. Rawlis and Johnny O'Connor's Hollywood's World War I Motion Picture Images, and the Tennessee Historical Quarterly. As section editor for the Encyclopedia of Appalachia, Birdwell also the moderator for the Listserv H. Appalachia. Birdwell is part of the expedition teams that went to France. So we're excited to have you, Michael.
Thanks.
No problem on you again.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't need have the lights up. I don't need this. I don't do AV. There's some other folks that need to be recognized that we're not recognized. Gerald York, retired colonel in the Army, is Alvin York's grandson, and he's with the Sergeant York Patriotic Foundation. His daughter Debbie is the chairman of the Sergeant York Patriotic Foundation. Jim Devlin, sitting there at the back, went on the 2nd expedition. Jim Tanner, there at the back, went on the 3rd expedition. He's with the Chattanooga Times. Manoa Uffelman is here from Austin Peay State University. And we have here on the front Dr. Elizabeth Probst and members of the Tennessee Tech History Club.
Yay!
Oh, and okay. I am tasked here to try to separate myth and reality, for one thing, and we've seen a little bit of that. I've been working with the York family since 1987. This is my 25th year to be involved with Sergeant York. George Edward has said that I know more about his father than he does, and I take that as an incredible compliment.
You're a better man.
And part of this task over the last 25 years, 25 years I've been doing this, is seeing a part of what we saw today and trying to pull out the mythology from the reality. And one of the panels in the exhibit is York, Man, and Myth. And people cannot separate that movie from what happened. You know, one of York's good friends was Arthur Bushing. And Arthur Bushing was his secretary. He came to work for York for $1. Said, I'll work for you for $1 a year. Then he realized after a couple of years, I need more money. And Bushing said of York, he said the characterization with Gary Cooper was all wrong. And if you want to know everything that's right about the movie and everything that's wrong, which is most of it, read my book. Celluloid Soldiers, Warner Brothers' Campaign Against Nazism, because chapters 4 and 5 are all about the movie, what's right, what's wrong, and it tells you why the story was deviated. I'll give you one little hint. This is the first film in American history where living people are being portrayed. First one. And they have to get affidavits saying, I will allow my person to be depicted on screen. Cordell Hull says yes. General Pershing says yes. York's father-in-law says no. York's brothers and sisters say no, except for Lucy and Jim. There's a problem already. The crux of the film is about getting bottomland soil. If you've been to Pall Mall, it ain't nothing but bottomland soil. So we had to create a completely different plot twist to take us away from this thing, and York perpetuated in that mythology. And that's another story. Read my book. So, York is a complicated man. If you see the Cooper portrayal, it's one-dimensional. Arthur Bushing said that one of the things he thought was wrong with that portrayal is that Gary Cooper says, yep, no, that's all he says. How you doing? Yep, no, yeah. And as Arthur Bushing said, Alvin York could talk the ears off a field of corn. That's a big difference. You know, he was not laconic. He also had an incredible sense of humor, as do the York family. If you haven't spent much time with them, it's a laugh riot. And so this exhibit, how this exhibit came to be, and David's going to talk about the installation of the exhibit, is Colonel Taylor Beatty, who's a retired colonel, who was with Special Ops. He was stationed in France and had gotten interested in the Lost Battalion story. And the Lost Battalion battlefield and the York battlefield are about 5 kilometers apart. And so in getting interested in the Lost Battalion story, he, by extension, gets interested in the York story. And so he writes an article for Army News called In Search of Sergeant York. And he goes into the area around Châtel-Châteaury to say, if I were the Germans, where would I locate the 4 German machine guns? And 4 is all we found. 4 is all that's in the German records. Where would I locate those machine guns? And so he built a model based upon his own experience as a military commander. Now, what would he do? And I read the article, thought it was quite good. It's one of the best descriptions of the battle. Tom Nolan, who you're going to hear from in a minute. Tom Nolan and I believe that George Patullo probably wrote the best description of the battle. I think the second best description was written by Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who York got to know. And Teddy Roosevelt Jr. and Luke Lee of Tennessee, Luke Lee of Nashville, started the American Legion. And so York gets to know these guys, and York had told his story to Teddy Roosevelt, who reprints it, which is a variation on the Patullo story. And so Tom calls me and he says, Michael, I think Taylor's wrong. I don't think Taylor is correct. And that's what started this whole thing in motion. Where did York's battle take place? And it's interesting, there are a couple of things we need to keep in mind. In 1918, beginning in September, beginning on September 29th to be exact, it began raining. It rained every day to November 11th. Now, we're not talking about downpours, we're talking about drizzly, nasty rain that you really can't, an umbrella's no good, but it's just that kind of misty, nasty rain. And it's raining every day. And it's cold. Also, why is September the 29th important for other Tennesseans in World War I? 30th Division breaches the Hindenburg Line on September 29th. 30th Division, which had been loaned to the British Second Corps. And those guys are largely forgotten. In fact, there have only been a couple of articles written about the 30th Division in one book. And those guys are going to breach the Hindenburg on September 29th, the day that this nasty rain's coming down. Well, these guys are also, it's uncomfortable, it's wet, it's nasty. There are things to keep in mind about World War I that we don't really think about. Just to give you an idea, you're no good. You might make it. You're no good. You're definitely no good. No good. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Yeah. And that's that, you've got to go clean shaven in order to get a tight seal on the gas mask. And so these guys are obsessed with hygiene in a way that people hadn't been obsessed with hygiene before. And so there's this whole thing, and think about trying to shave in an artillery barrage. People had to worry about that. You know, that's why we get rid of cutthroat razors and start using safety razors. But by the way, the guy who made the safety razor, Mr. Kampf, invented it in 1887. He sold the patent for $1. In 1915, just after the war started, sold the patent for $1 to King Gillette. And whose name do you remember? Well, so it's nasty. These guys they've got to worry about lice. They call them lice pants rabbits, seed squirrels, cooties. So life is uncomfortable, it's miserable. And the Samahel salient that he was mentioning, where these guys get bloodied for the first time, was miserable. It's an introduction to the misery. And so, when these guys are when they get pinned down on the 7th of October, and then they're to move forward on the 8th, and York and the 17 men from Company G are deployed, what they have, they've got a couple of things going for them. The forest is full. But that rain that's been a problem works to their advantage because it dampens the sounds of the leaves. If those leaves had been dry, we're trying to flank the machine gun, they would have been heard long before they got into that valley, and they would have been detected much more easily. Another thing, we actually tried it. You know, when you've got the guys running down the hill, charging them, the hill's about like this. You can't run down that hill. I tried running down that hill, and I landed on my butt about halfway down it. So that adds another dimension. This notion these guys charging in, well, they're scooting, you know. And so that adds another dimension to how this battlefield plays out. Another thing, where York took cover, the bank goes like this and down. He could flatten himself against the bank. The machine gun's here, and the guy has to depress himself up over the barrel so that the head and shoulders come full into view. And so piecing these things together and being on the ground give us a better perspective than what we've had in the past. A couple other things, just because I can't wait to see the finished exhibit. And I don't want to waste a lot of time here, because I'm really excited about this. This is 5 years' work, you know? And finally see this thing at fruition is a huge deal. But I got an email yesterday. Brock Hill, who is the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation, is actually moving forward on something that Tom and I and David tried to get going over a year ago. It looks like there's going to be a Great War Centennial Commission established. And this exhibit can be the kickoff. And Tennessee can be ahead of the game for the rest of the United States. That's huge. That's huge. And I'm really proud of what we've done here. But two things to keep in mind when thinking about Sergeant York. One, he was an extraordinary man. He was. He did what was beyond his wildest imagining. And to keep this in mind, Alvin York was born in Pall Mall. It's Pall Mall. Repeat after me. Pall Mall. If you say Pall Mall or Pall Mall, they know you're not from around there, so you better look out. He came from Pall Mall, Tennessee. He was the second of 11 children who lived in a 2-room log cabin that's smaller than this room. You've got 13 people living in a space smaller than this. He had what he called a 3rd grade education. It was 9 months. 9 months total education before he had to go to work. And he had to work at the age of 9. And I mean work. And so he has this humble beginning where there's really no future to speak of. His father dies. His father was an itinerant blacksmith. His father dies, and he has to take over the family as a teenager because his 2 older brothers have left home. And he bows to the pressures of that. I can't imagine. I know what I was like at that age. I can't imagine trying to be responsible for brothers and sisters. And he cracked under the pressure. He did. You know, George Edward asked him, he said, "Dad, were you really as bad as they depict you in film?" And what did he say, George Edward? What did he say?
I didn't hear you.
So you asked your dad, you know, if he was as bad as they depicted him in the early part of the film. What'd you say?
He said he was worse.
And so, you know, as he says, he broke the stone dry law. He started drinking. Tennessee goes dry in 1909, so Tennessee's already dry. Kentucky's already dry. But moonshine can be found anywhere and everywhere. And, you know, he lives the life of a hellion there for a while until his best friend gets killed. And that changes everything. Changes everything. And when he converted, his family was raised Methodist. And when he's converted, he converts to the Church of Christ and Christian Union on January the 1st, 1915. H.H. Russell was leading a revival. And York has the death of his friend weighing on his shoulders. And he goes in and he commits to this fundamentalist sect because it gave him the support and the answers and the comfort he needed in a time of crisis. It did. Now, he grew beyond that, but he remained a committed Christian, no question about it. The second thing to remember about York is that we have this humble man from humble beginnings who goes through this terrible tragedy and is against going to war because the Church of Christ and Christian Union is against it. How many people have ever heard of the Church of Christ and Christian Union? See, I didn't think so. Well, you have, of course. I asked one of York's friends, Guy Williams, what the 3CU was like before I ever went to one of their services, and he goes, "Well, you take the Church of Christ, you take the Nazarene, you put them both together and take out all the fun either one allows." And so, the second thing to remember is that here's this guy who's been in a very insular world. Before he shipped out to the Army, the furthest north he'd been was Albany, Kentucky. The furthest south was Jamestown. The furthest the furthest west was Salina. And then when he embarks to go to the Army, the first is Harriman, because he's going to get on the train in Harriman to go down to Camp Gordon, Georgia, and Atlanta. His world is going to be, I mean, just if he'd gone to Atlanta, that would have rocked his world. And the Army does the other thing. The Army gives him the discipline that he needs. The Army gives him the training he needs. The Army opens his eyes to a larger world, whether he'd gone overseas or not. And the Army made him confront who he was and help define who he is. Excuse me. And yet, who he is has been lost to the mythology. And the mythology began almost immediately. And what part of this exhibit does, and what hopefully future exhibits will be able to do, I'm currently working on another documentary with John White about the mythologization of Sergeant York. We're working on this. How did this man go from man to myth? We're working on that documentary right now. And they've seen teaser reels from it. And this man is amazing. He really, really is amazing. And when you look at the offers that were made him, there are a couple of offers that I wish he'd taken, and he did take offers over time if they had to do with education or progressive causes for the people of Tennessee. He was offered to go on the Ziegfeld Follies and do trick shooting while Will Rogers did trick roping. I would have loved to see that show. And York goes from being this parochial person to an international person because of the Army. He becomes an incredible public speaker. You know, his first speeches, when he's trying to raise money for education, were written by Arthur Bushing. But by the late 1920s, he's writing his own speeches. And one of my favorite speeches is at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in 1941. That speech is quoted by FDR. And he says, "You people who are gathered here today you know somebody else could have been invited. There are other, more prominent speakers who could have been invited today. There's a world-famous aviator, for one, meaning he's Charles Lindbergh. There's a famous senator, meaning Benedict Champ Clark. And he mentions some other people. He goes, but I was invited. And I would say that all the medals I was ever given, none of them came with the personal blessings of Adolf Hitler, which Lindbergh's medals did. He wrote that speech. So I don't want you to think of Alvin York as a one-dimensional hillbilly. He's not. And I think that the real man is far more interesting than mythology. But you can't get there until you confront the mythology. And that's all I got to say.
Such an incredibly important part of putting all this together, the displays downtown, and we're thrilled to have all of this talent and experience and history come together at the same time. David Curry is principal at Encore Interpretive Design, an interpretive planning and media company located in Nashville. Over the last 15 years, David has worked with museums, historic sites, and preservation organizations to help them tell their stories, including documentary film exhibition and publications. He has produced several documentaries on Tennessee's Civil War experience in recent years. Currently, he's exploring the range of interactive audio-visual experiences that can be used to engage 21st century audiences. Curry documented the expeditions to France and designed In the Footsteps of Sergeant York, the exhibit that opens today. We've got it good to go. Please come share it. He wants to open with a presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, David. I'm the third rail on the project. Back in the summer of 2005, I got a phone call from Tom Melvin. Stand up, Tom. Everybody needs to. Tom and I have worked on several projects over probably the last 10 or 12 years. And I got this phone call. He says, you know, we're going to have lunch at this Mexican restaurant in Murfreesboro, me and Bertie, Michael Birdwell. Come have lunch with us. I got this really exciting project. Of course, I immediately find out it's a project so he can do his dissertation. And we're going to go to France, and we're going to find out where Alvin York won his Medal of Honor. And I said, well, we don't know where that is, considering it's very well documented. He said, well, not exactly. There's some articles out there, some stuff that's been written. And one person says one thing, and another person says something. The French say the French say this, the Germans say that, the United States Army says, you know, this third or fourth. And then there's all this other stuff that's out there. No, what we want to do is we want to take science, geographic information systems, and we want to find out precisely, using science, where this took place. Do you want to go with us and document this whole thing? And then maybe we can create a documentary, maybe we can do something else with it. So I said, sure, we're going to France. Why not? When are we going? Well, we're going in March. I said, okay, March, what's the weather like in March? Well, it's going to be nice. So I load all of my film equipment and gear up, thinking that, okay, yeah, it might be nice, but it also might be really awful. And of course, when we showed up, it was really awful. There was about an inch of snow on the ground. We got up in the mornings, it was about 20, 25 degrees. We headed off really before daylight every morning to try to get into the field to locate these positions. And what was important about going during the winter was that there's not any leaves on the trees. And so Tom, using his GPS unit to document each location that he had done some meticulous research to try to identify, we could map it. And when you visit the exhibit, you'll be able to see that process, that it's an extraordinary process that Tom Nolan went through, pulling all of the primary source materials, all the stuff that had been written, whether it was, again, primary source or secondary source documents, using a lot of Michael Birdwell's research, Taylor Beatty's research, other people's research, and strip away all of the adverse stories. What didn't fit? And can the science help us through GIS, through maps, through surface field archaeology, to try to find out where this actually took place. And it is a meticulous process that began the summer of 2005 and really just, I think, ended in a new Tennessee Historical Quarterly article that's going to come out in January that I hope everybody picks up a copy, because it'll have several articles in there. I think Michael's writing one, Tom's writing one, and Brad Posey, who's one of the archaeologists on the project from Germany. It was an international team from 6 different countries that put this together. And so there were 3 expeditions over there. The exhibit itself focuses on what's the mythology, what's the background of Alvin York, trying to strip some of that early history away. What happened on October 8th? Were there this many machine guns or that many machine guns? Could we take the science and actually locate where those machine gun nests were? And at least to our understanding, we did. And it was a very difficult terrain to work in. And not only because of the weather, but because of the terrain itself. Very hilly environment, a lot of trees. You don't know if you get turned around over there exactly which way. Again, it's like going into Fentress County. You get turned around 1 or 2 ways and you might not know exactly where you are. Everything over there is in French, of course, and us being Americans and none of us really understanding French very well, though we did have an interpreter that was with us who did a fabulous job, Fred Castier, who's actually going to take this exhibit when it's finished and put it over in France for a while, so that the French, at least in their terms, it's not so much educating French, because what you find out is the French know more about Alvin York than the vast majority of Tennesseans did. And you find that out when you talk to them. And they're still fascinated by the character of Sergeant York, and it's not so much the Gary Cooper model, which they were introduced to York through Gary Cooper too, but they understand the terrain over there and what took place. And again, it's a story they know extremely well. And I interviewed some of the French that were over there about what they understood from the life of Alvin York, and you get this fascinating story from all these different people and all the stuff that they collected. So I encourage everybody to if you get an opportunity, to visit, even today if you want to, the exhibit itself, and you can see the process that Tom went through, the artifacts that were found, because again, 6 men were killed in the unit, in the 17-man unit. One of the objectives of one of the expeditions over there was to try to find out where those original burials were, because the men were buried. They were left for 2 weeks on the battlefield where they lay. They were not moved. 2 weeks later, they were buried. Then they were disinterred over the next couple of years and then removed to the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. Were there any of those remains? Had anything fallen off of those uniforms, those bodies that might still be over there? And much to our surprise, maybe, on the second expedition, 2 very important pieces were located. One, a collar disc. And I think Jim was in on that, was he not?
He watched it.
Yeah.
We found a little disc and went down to the creek, washed it off, and screamed 328, 328.
328 G.
Yeah.
And that told us that we were in the right spot. Some of you may or may not know there is some controversy about whether or not we're in the right place. There was another team that was looking in a different place from where we were. But of course, we were using science, and we found a collar disc. And at least from the research we understood, that's the only place the 328 was. They weren't further up into this valley where somebody else believed that all of this took place. I've got a short clip and it's going to be part of the exhibit for you to look at to see kind of what the terrain looks like today and some of the background stuff that Tom and the rest of the team did that were involved with this. After that's over, it's only about 7 or 8 minutes long. Anybody that wants to ask any questions, especially to Mr. Nolan, who didn't feel like he wanted to get up here and talk to you, we'll be happy to answer any of them. But if you want to go ahead and hit that.
I think the story of Sergeant York is appealing to many, many people. Not just the people of America, not just the people Tennessee, but the people the whole world wide. It's a story of epic bravery, a man who is a skilled shot, who is able to take on the German army in effect and come through and win.
In summer 2005, my friend Michael Kelly from the UK and I went over to Cherry to tour around. I'd been toying with the idea of trying to do some GIS analysis in that area, and that was when I initially attempted to follow in the footsteps of Alan York. At the time, I was looking for a dissertation topic for my PhD, and what I wanted to do was demonstrate the utility of geographic information science for recreating the pattern of historic events on the modern landscape with map overlay and documentary integration with the maps. And so, with my friend Michael Birdwell from Tennessee Tech and David Curry, historian from Nashville, and several other folks, we decided to go over in spring break of March 2006 and see if we couldn't find enough artifacts to compare with the documentary evidence and maps and see if we could locate York's position. By our calculations, one of the grave sites is going to be right around in that area. The other one is going to be right up there. So this forum there. That's according to the Danforth map. Well, the American Army embarked on the Meuse-Argonne offense in late September 1918, and the 82nd Division was in reserve, and on the 7th they were ordered into combat, and York's outfit, which was G Company, the 2nd Battalion of the 328th Infantry, was given the task of attacking and severing a German narrow gauge railway to the west of the village of Châtel-Chehery. The attack started about 6 in the morning. It was really rainy and cold. It was the 8th of October. York's company and his platoon were on the very far left flank of the 2nd Battalion attack. York's platoon sergeant, Harry Parsons, ordered 3 squads to try to move to the left and silence the machine gun fire from the left flank. And York commanded one of the 3 squads that went. They surprised the Germans who began to surrender. Other Germans who were manning machine guns further up the slope saw what was happening and turned their guns around and fired on the Americans, and they killed 6 instantly, wounded 3 others, including all of the non-commissioned officers except Alan York. So as the senior non-commissioned officer, he took command of the patrol using his rifle and pistol. He silenced the German machine gun fire. He killed between 20 and 25 Germans. Eventually, because of his accurate fire, the German lieutenant in command surrendered to him. He and the other 7 men took their wounded and escorted the prisoners back to the battalion command post, which was a little bit southwest of the village of Châtel-Chehery. And at that point, the prisoners were counted. He had captured 132 Germans.
When we got to France the first time and also the second time, the French people were curious to see what we were doing. And they came out of the woodwork, as it were, to see what are these people doing and what's all this equipment they're carrying and heading off down into the woods down below the town. They were very interested in what we were doing.
So I'm not going to New York.
What's the name?
C.H. Campbell.
Campbell. Campbell. Yeah, Campbell. Southern Lake in USA.
The Chatel is a man by the name of Alain Brecal, who was a policeman in Paris, but who's moved to Chatel. And we met him on the first trip, and he wanted to show us things that he'd just found. And so in his little shack behind his house, he had the sort of things we thought we'd find.
Depuis combien de temps en fait connais-tu cette histoire qui est autour de York, etc. Comment tu as fait ça?
En achetant ici en 81.
Okay. When he bought this house in 1991, he started to have some received some information about Saint-Jean.
Mais quand j'étais plus jeune, j'avais déjà vu le film.
But when he was younger, he saw the movie with Gary Cooper. So he makes a connection when he arrived here with the movie and the real story. And it started to be a very interesting place. And never he thought that he could be one day to live in Château-Chiry where York was.
And our objective over this last 5 days has been to, in some way, shape or form, perhaps decide where York fought. Not to prove or to disprove his story, but for the benefit of the people of France, for the people of the United States, and also for the people of Germany, to have an opportunity to look at Sergeant York, the mythical efforts of a soldier from Tennessee 90 years ago. And by using technical aids that we have this week, I think we have made great achievements, and there is hope for many, many people.
Discussion or questions and answers, and we invite the folks that have presented, David and Michael and Tom Nolan, to be available if there are any questions, comments.
Let's go see the exhibit.
Tom, the equipment, if you would just briefly tell them what they will see down there, what y'all are using for the geo.
Well, the primary piece of equipment is the GPS unit we use to record the locations of all the artifacts we recovered. And when we found something, we would mark it and then come back and map each individual artifact. And then by looking at the patterns and the types of artifacts, we were able to kind of reconstruct what happened there. There is one thing I'd like to say, is that this was a total volunteer operation. Michael Birdwell and I received some funding from our respective universities, but all the other participants paid their own way and spent their own time to help us. And without their help, it would have been impossible to achieve what we did. And all of them are listed on one of the panels of the exhibit, and I just want to say that it was an international group effort. It wasn't any specific individual who achieved this. It was only done through the work of a lot of people. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, anybody else with specific questions? Stan, would you just make a comment, maybe to close this comment about why any of this matters anyway?
It matters because there's a famous expression, I think it was George Saint-Diana here, maybe one of the French historians, said, people who do not, just to paraphrase, people who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And I think the importance of understanding our heritage, where we came from, is critical in terms of shaping our world and influencing our decisions and hopefully making better decisions. That's sort of in a broad sense, but in a narrow sense, one of the things that has happened, I think, is a good thing in history over the past couple, 3 decades is, okay, we've established the big broad things. Some of what I tried to do today, a little bit of the context of why we got into the war and what was going on and what were the major decisions. But the trend has been to, okay, let's neck it down, if you will, even to an individual, the human experience, what people went through in the various episodes in war and how they reacted and how they rose to the occasion or many times collapsed under the stress and strain of it. And so I think that human dimension, that human factor is utterly critical in understanding what goes on in something as huge and monumental as warfare. And by looking at someone as significant as Sergeant York, and as you said, breaking away from the mythology, the Hollywood hype and whatever, and looking at what the real man was, what his real motivations were, why he made the decisions and actions that he made and took, I think is a fundamentally important way of us understanding what we are as human beings. And that's why things like this are critically important, in the broad and in the narrow sense.
Thank you very much. And that's exactly what we're hoping to do. As the Museum of the American Military Experience uses this to launch future projects, the immediate plans for the In the Footsteps of Sergeant York after 6 months here will be at the Pink Palace in Memphis. And we're just real excited to see it get off to such a great start and getting out to the public and sharing the message. But it's part of what we're trying to do as a museum, truly to share the experience. And it's the soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen themselves, but it's also the families that they all represent. So thank you all for coming. We're excited to be able to share it all with you.
And also, Dr. McCoy, I'd like to really thank the York family for coming, because it's
amen.
long, and no telling how many thousands of presentations you have attended. So.
And I forgot to mention Angie. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Amen. And it is. I mean, what an effort. We sure appreciate it that y'all are here and a part of it. And we're excited about how it's turned out. Thank you very much.